Let me tell you something that most people get completely wrong about the Russia-Ukraine conflict. They assume that Russia's greatest leverage comes from its nuclear arsenal, its energy exports, or its ability to sustain grinding attrition warfare. And on the surface, that logic makes total sense. Why wouldn't it? These are the tools that dominate headlines, drive policy debates, and keep Western analysts awake at night. But here's where it gets interesting. And honestly, this idea flipped my entire understanding of how great power competition actually works in the 21st century. Russia's most powerful weapon against the United States isn't deployed on battlefields in Ukraine or positioned in missile silos across Siberia. It's already embedded deep inside American institutions, woven into the fabric of domestic politics, and actively reshaping how the United States makes strategic decisions. The weapon is polarization itself. Not polarization that Russia created from scratch, but polarization that already existed. Polarization that Russia simply learned to weaponize with remarkable precision. And what makes this particularly unsettling is that every American response to Russian aggression, every debate about Ukraine aid, every argument about military commitments abroad feeds the very mechanism that undermines American strategic coherence. The paradox is almost perfect. The more seriously America takes the Russia threat, the more deeply the polarization weapon cuts. Most people see Russian influence operations, social media manipulation, and information warfare as supplementary tactics, minor annoyances compared to conventional military power. But that completely misses what's actually happening. These aren't supporting elements in Russia's strategy. They are the strategy. And the genius lies not in the sophistication of the influence operations themselves, but in Russia's recognition that it doesn't need to create division in American society. It only needs to amplify what's already there. To understand why that matters so much, you have to think about what strategic coherence actually represents in a geopolitical competition between nuclear-armed powers. Strategic coherence is the ability of a state to identify interests, formulate policy to advance those interests, allocate resources toward that policy, and sustain that commitment over time, despite opposition and setbacks. It's the connective tissue between recognition of threat and effective response to threat. Without strategic coherence, a country can possess overwhelming military capability, vast economic resources, and extensive alliance networks while still losing geopolitical competitions because it cannot organize those advantages toward consistent purpose. Now, strategic coherence requires certain preconditions to function. It requires some baseline level of elite consensus about fundamental interests, not unanimous agreement on every policy detail, but shared understanding of what the country is trying to accomplish in the world and why. It requires institutional capacity to translate policy decisions into actual resource allocation and implementation. And critically, it requires time horizons that extend beyond immediate electoral cycles, allowing strategies to develop through multiple phases without complete reversal every few years. The United States possessed robust strategic coherence during certain historical periods. The early Cold War, roughly from 1947 through the late 1960s, demonstrated remarkable bipartisan consensus on containment doctrine. Republicans and Democrats argued about tactics and specific commitments, but both parties accepted the fundamental framework that Soviet expansion must be systematically opposed through military, economic, and ideological instruments. That consensus enabled multi-decade commitments like NATO, the Marshall Plan, and forward military deployments that remained stable through multiple administrations. The coherence wasn't absolute, and it eventually fractured over Vietnam. But for 2 decades, it provided the foundation for sustained strategic competition. What Russia has recognized is that contemporary American political polarization has essentially destroyed this precondition for strategic coherence. The polarization operates at multiple levels simultaneously. At the mass public level, Republicans and Democrats no longer merely disagree about policy priorities. They increasingly inhabit different informational universes, assign different credibility to different sources, and interpret the same events through incompatible frameworks. At the elite level, bipartisan consensus on foreign policy has collapsed. Republican and Democratic foreign policy establishments, which maintained significant overlap throughout the Cold War, have diverged into competing worldviews about America's role, the nature of threats, and the utility of alliances. At the institutional level, this polarization translates into into inability to sustain commitments. When one party gains power, it systematically reverses the previous administration's foreign policy initiatives, not because circumstances have changed, but because the initiatives originated with the opposing party. International agreements become worthless because allies recognize they may be abandoned within 4 years. Long-term strategic investments become impossible because funding depends on legislative majorities that swing unpredictably. This creates an environment where Russia doesn't need to defeat American military forces or collapse the American economy. It only needs to ensure that polarization remains sufficiently intense that strategic coherence cannot emerge. And the mechanism for ensuring that is almost absurdly simple. Take any issue related to Russia, Ukraine, or European security and inject it into American domestic political discourse in a way that maps onto existing partisan divides. The polarization machinery does the rest. Here's the second thing to understand. Russia's influence operations don't create the polarization. They catalyze it. They identify existing fault lines in American political discourse and ensure that every debate about Russia or Ukraine activates those fault lines in the most divisive way possible. Consider the Ukraine aid debates in Congress. The underlying question, whether the United States should provide military and economic assistance to Ukraine to resist Russian invasion, is fundamentally a strategic question about American interests, European security architecture, and the precedents being set for future conflicts. But the moment this question enters American political discourse, it immediately transforms into a proxy battle for completely unrelated domestic political conflicts. For Republicans skeptical of foreign entanglements, Ukraine aid becomes another example of globalist elites prioritizing foreign interests over domestic needs, echoing isolationist themes that have deep roots in American conservative politics. For Republicans concerned about deficit spending, Ukraine aid becomes another massive expenditure that America cannot afford while domestic infrastructure crumbles and entitlement programs face insolvency. For Republicans who view progressive cultural politics as existential threat, Ukraine's association with Democratic Party support makes opposition to Ukraine aid a form of resistance to broader liberal political agenda. For Democrats, support for Ukraine aid becomes intertwined with resistance to Trumpism, defense of liberal international order, and moral clarity about defending democracy against authoritarianism. Opposition to Ukraine aid gets coded as Putin apologism, isolationism, or betrayal of American values. Notice what's happened in this transformation. The strategic question about whether supporting Ukraine advances American interests has become completely subordinate to how Ukraine support maps onto pre-existing partisan identities and conflicts. The debate is no longer primarily about Ukraine or Russia. It's about whether you're the kind of American who supports foreign aid and alliances versus the kind who prioritizes domestic concerns and sovereignty. It's about whether you're with the globalist elite or the nationalist populist, whether you believe American power should be expansive or restrained, whether you trust institutional expertise or popular skepticism. Russia doesn't need to control this process. It only needs to ensure the process accelerates. That's what influence operations accomplish. Russian social media accounts don't create the arguments. They amplify existing arguments from both sides, ensuring maximum visibility for the most polarizing voices, the most extreme positions, the most divisive framing. Russian media outlets provide platforms for American commentators across the political spectrum, not to spread Russian propaganda directly, but to elevate American voices that naturally push polarization deeper. A Republican congressman questioning Ukraine aid gets featured on Russian state media, not because he's a Russian agent, but because his statements, amplified, deepen the partisan divide. A Democratic commentator characterizing Ukraine aid opponents as Putin sympathizers gets signal boosted through bot networks, not because Russia agrees with the characterization, but because it makes bipartisan consensus impossible. The brilliance of this approach is its efficiency. Russia expends minimal resources, some social media manipulation, some media coverage, some strategic amplification, and American political dynamics do the heavy lifting. The polarization machinery operates independently. Russia just ensures it runs at maximum intensity whenever Russian interests are at stake. Now layer on top of that the question of how this affects actual American strategic capacity. Start with the most obvious manifestation: policy instability. The United States cannot make credible long-term commitments to Ukraine or European allies because those commitments depend on congressional appropriations that shift with electoral outcomes and legislative majorities that fluctuate unpredictably. When European allies look at American support for Ukraine, they don't see reliable partnership. They see support that could evaporate in the next election cycle, aid packages that barely survive congressional votes, and political theater where Ukraine's survival becomes a bargaining chip in completely unrelated domestic political battles. This forces European countries into impossible positions. Do they increase their own defense spending and military commitments to Ukraine based on assumptions of sustained American support that might disappear? Or do they hedge, maintaining relationships with Russia that would be unnecessary if American commitments were credible, thereby undermining the very coalition that makes resistance to Russia viable? The instability creates strategic paralysis, but the deeper effect operates at the level of decision-making coherence. When polarization is sufficiently intense, every decision about Russia or Ukraine becomes primarily a calculation about domestic political advantage rather than strategic effectiveness. Republican legislators don't vote against Ukraine aid primarily because they've concluded it's strategically unwise. They vote against it because their political survival depends on maintaining favor with a base that has been conditioned to view Ukraine's support as symbolic of everything they oppose in the broader culture war. Democratic legislators don't vote for Ukraine aid primarily because they've conducted rigorous strategic analysis. They vote for it because opposition would be politically fatal within a coalition that has defined itself in opposition to Trumpism and everything they associate with his skepticism toward alliances and international institutions. The strategic question, does this specific aid package advance American interest given current battlefield conditions, Ukrainian capacity, Russian vulnerabilities, and broader geopolitical dynamics, becomes almost irrelevant to the actual voting decision. The policy outcome is determined by partisan positioning rather than strategic assessment. This is catastrophic for the kind of adaptive, responsive strategic competition that great power conflict requires. Effective strategy demands constant adjustment based on changing conditions, new information, and evolving understanding of adversary capabilities and intentions. But when every adjustment must navigate hyperpolarized domestic politics, adaptation becomes nearly impossible. Think about what happens when battlefield conditions in Ukraine shift. Suppose Ukrainian offensives stall, territorial gains prove elusive, and the conflict settles into protracted stalemate. Strategic logic might suggest adjusting American support toward different objectives, perhaps prioritizing Ukrainian defensive capabilities over offensive operations, shifting resources toward economic stabilization rather than military hardware, or exploring diplomatic frameworks that accept temporary partition while ensuring long-term Ukrainian sovereignty and European security. But in hyper-polarized environment, any adjustment to Ukraine policy immediately becomes ammunition in domestic political warfare. Reducing certain types of military aid gets characterized as abandoning Ukraine, betraying allies, and validating Putin. Increasing certain types of aid gets characterized as endless foreign entanglement, throwing good money after bad and prioritizing globalist adventures over American workers. Exploring diplomatic options gets characterized simultaneously as appeasement and as reckless warmongering, depending on which partisan audience is evaluating it. The result is strategic rigidity. American policy becomes locked into frameworks established during initial crisis response, unable to adapt even when adaptation would serve American interests, because any change activates polarization dynamics that make the political cost prohibitive. Russia doesn't need to win battlefield victories in Ukraine under these conditions. It only needs to survive long enough for American polarization to paralyze American strategy. And survival is precisely what Russia's approach to the Ukraine war optimizes for. Russia isn't trying to achieve rapid territorial conquest or decisive military victory. It's pursuing a strategy of exhaustion, betting that it can sustain grinding attrition longer than the United States and Europe can sustain political coherence around Ukraine support. Every month, the war continues without clear Ukrainian victory. American public support erodes slightly. Every aid package that barely passes Congress reinforces the perception that support is unsustainable. Every Republican presidential candidate who questions Ukraine commitments signals to European allies that the political foundation for American involvement is crumbling. Russia just needs to not lose catastrophically. As long as it maintains some territorial gains, continues inflicting casualties, and preserves its military as functioning force, time works in Russia's favor because time allows American polarization to deepen and strategic coherence to further deteriorate. Now add to this something that makes the polarization weapon particularly effective in this specific historical moment. The United States faces simultaneous strategic competitions with multiple peer or near-peer competitors: Russia in Europe, China in the Pacific, Iran in the Middle East, while also managing ongoing counterterrorism commitments, alliance obligations, and domestic political polarization. This creates impossible resource allocation decisions. The defense budget is finite, military personnel are finite, industrial capacity for weapons production is finite, political attention and public tolerance for foreign commitments are finite. In less polarized environment, these trade-offs would be debated through strategic frameworks. How much priority should European security receive relative to Pacific deterrence? Should resources flow toward immediate conflicts like Ukraine or toward long-term capability development for potential China conflict? What level of risk is acceptable in the Middle East while resources concentrate elsewhere? These are legitimate strategic questions with no obvious answers, requiring careful analysis of threats, capabilities, interests, and opportunity costs. But in hyper-polarized environment, these trade-offs immediately become partisan litmus tests. Support Ukraine too much, and you're accused of neglecting the China threat, the real strategic competition of the century. Support Taiwan too much, and you're accused of abandoning European allies to Russian aggression. Prioritize defense spending increases, and you're militaristic and fiscally irresponsible. Question defense spending increases, and you're weak on national security. Every resource allocation decision becomes a vehicle for domestic political warfare rather than strategic calculation. Russia benefits enormously from this dynamic because it ensures America cannot concentrate resources effectively. While Russia focuses singular attention on Ukraine and European security architecture, the United States must fragment attention and resources across multiple theaters. While Russia can sustain long-term commitment to undermining European security because domestic Russian politics, however authoritarian and problematic, provides Putin stable long-term control, American commitments fluctuate with electoral cycles and legislative majorities. Project this forward, and what you see is not Russian military victory over American forces. What you see is Russian strategic victory through American strategic exhaustion and paralysis. The United States doesn't lose because Russia defeats American military. It loses because it cannot organize its superior resources toward coherent strategic purpose, cannot sustain commitments long enough for them to achieve effects, and cannot adapt strategy to changing conditions because adaptation triggers domestic political warfare. European allies, recognizing the fundamental unreliability of American commitments given domestic polarization, begin making independent accommodations with Russia. These accommodations appear as pragmatic adjustments to reality, maintaining energy relationships, limiting military commitments, avoiding policies that provoke Russian retaliation. But collectively, they represent the disintegration of the coalition that would be necessary to contain Russian revisionism. Ukraine, unable to count on sustained Western support, eventually accepts territorial concessions and political constraints that amount to partial Russian victory. Not because Ukraine lacks will to resist or because Russian military proves superior, but because the West cannot maintain strategic coherence long enough to provide Ukraine the time and resources necessary for successful resistance. The global economic implications extend far beyond Europe. When the United States demonstrates inability to sustain strategic commitments because of domestic polarization, every country observing international politics adjusts their calculations. Allies reconsider the value of American security guarantees. Why accept constraints on your foreign policy options in exchange for American protection if that protection might evaporate in the next election? Why invest in interoperability with American military systems if American commitment to your defense is contingent on which party controls Congress? Adversaries become more aggressive. If American responses to aggression are constrained by domestic polarization that makes sustained pushback politically impossible, the cost of challenging American interest decreases. China looks at American paralysis over Ukraine and updates its assessment of likely American responses to Taiwan scenarios. Iran looks at American political dysfunction and calculates that American threats are increasingly hollow because follow-through would require domestic political consensus that no longer exists. At the structural level, what we're witnessing is the erosion of the political foundation that has sustained American global influence since 1945. That influence never rested primarily on military superiority or economic dominance, though both mattered. It rested on credibility. The credibility that American commitments were reliable, that American threats were serious, that American allies could count on sustained support, and that American adversaries would face consistent opposition. Credibility requires the political capacity to make commitments and sustain them over time despite opposition and setbacks. Hyperpolarization destroys that capacity. When allies cannot trust that American commitments will survive the next election, when adversaries can exploit American political divisions to paralyze American responses, when every foreign policy decision becomes primarily a domestic political calculation, credibility evaporates. And without credibility, all the aircraft carriers and economic power and alliance networks become substantially less effective as instruments of influence. Russia understands this at a level that should honestly make American strategists deeply uncomfortable. The Russians have studied American political dynamics with the same rigor that American strategists once studied Soviet capabilities. They've identified the critical vulnerability, not military weakness or economic fragility, but political polarization that prevents strategic coherence. And they've developed a theory of victory that doesn't require matching American military power or economic capacity. It only requires ensuring that American polarization remains intense enough to prevent the United States from organizing its advantages effectively. The resources required to execute this strategy are minimal compared to the resources required to compete with American military directly. Some social media operations, some strategic amplification of divisive voices, some media coverage that highlights American political dysfunction, and the polarization machinery does the rest. So when you zoom all the way out and look at the complete picture, what you see is not the kind of great power competition most people imagine. It's not primarily about tanks and missiles and industrial capacity, though all those matter in specific contexts. It's about whether the United States can recover sufficient strategic coherence to sustain long-term competition against adversaries who don't suffer from the same political fragmentation. And right now, the evidence suggests that not only has America not solved the polarization problem, the polarization is intensifying. Every election cycle, partisan divisions deepen. Every foreign policy debate becomes more toxic. Every attempt at bipartisan consensus on national security issues faces greater obstacles. Russia doesn't need to make this worse indefinitely. It only needs to ensure the polarization remains acute for another 5 years, maybe 10, while American commitments unravel, allies lose faith, adversaries grow bolder, and the international order that American credibility sustained for decades continues fragmenting. The weapon isn't nuclear arsenals or hypersonic missiles or cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, though Russia possesses all of those. The weapon is polarization. It was already inside America before Russia recognized its strategic potential. Russia just learned how to activate it. And every American response to Russian aggression, every debate about how seriously to take the Russia threat, every argument about Ukraine aid or European security or defense spending feeds the mechanism that makes coherent strategic response impossible. That's the trap. Not a trap built through active manipulation, though Russian influence operations certainly exist. A trap built through patient observation of American political pathologies and systematic exploitation of vulnerabilities that Americans created themselves. The real question isn't whether Russia can win a military conflict against NATO. The question is whether America can restore the political coherence necessary to compete strategically over decades against adversaries who have identified polarization as the critical American vulnerability and built their strategy around exploiting it. And if you look honestly at the trajectory of American political polarization, at the incentives driving both parties deeper into partisan warfare, at the media ecosystem that profits from division, at the social dynamics that reward extreme positions and punish compromise, the answer to that question is not particularly encouraging. Empires don't usually collapse because they're conquered militarily. They erode from within, losing the political capacity to organize their resources toward coherent purpose. And right now, that erosion is progressing with remarkable speed.